se još malo prikupe.
Da, nek sjednu.
Okay, maybe we could start now. Good afternoon to everybody.
Can they hear you?
Do you hear us? Yes, okay. My name is Vladimir Jovic and I'm coming from Belgrade, from Serbia. I'm greatly honored to be able to chair this session and to be in Trieste again for I don't know how many times to participate in these fantastic conferences again on invitation of our colleagues from Trieste, especially Dr. Roberto Messina. Also, the title of this session is very important for me because it's saying something about humanization and deinstitutionalization and the links between two of these topics. And just for the start, I have to say that we will have only two presentations for this afternoon because Professor Sashi Sajdiharan will not be able to attend this meeting, which is great pity. On the other hand, as my role is just to facilitate and to help this panel, I would like to give some just introductory remarks because when we are talking about psychiatric institutions, having it in a large picture, we are talking about the places of violence. Places where the people who do have mental disorders are at risk at being physically, psychologically abused by many means, and these institutions are the institutions where we see, observe, where we monitor many abuses of their rights, all the way up to the real concrete cases of torture. And one of these things is what is fascinating me, how is it that these institutions are being alive for so many years, since we know that the basic features of the asylums were drawn by all the way down to Esquirol in 1836, I think, where he published the ideology of why mentally ill should be excluded from families, from society, what are the roles, what is the therapeutic role of asylum, etc. He even proposed the name asylum, thinking that it is a better name for these kind of institutions. But me coming from the Serbia, Western Balkans region, being involved in different war crimes, war-related violence on a massive scale, then being involved into, let's say, humanization of psychiatric institutions, prisons, social care institutions, police stations, all those things through the mechanisms of human rights protections, through the prevention of torture mechanism and so on. I was just wondering how is it possible that those institutions survive and how this ideology or let's say implicit theory beyond it can be reproduced to every new generation of psychiatrists, prison guards, etc. And I was very much interested in the last decade about the process of dehumanization, which I think it's in the basis of interpersonal violence and in the basis of the human rights abuse within all those closed institutions. It would be nice to talk about psychological mechanisms which are involved into this perception of the other being as somebody who is less human or who should be locked in or who is irreparably damaged or who is not allowed to be a part of society, it will be too long discussion. But these two topics that we will hear today are somehow intertwined. Both of them are related to human rights, but also to deinstitutionalization. And in our group in Belgrade, we had a lot of discussions with human rights activists, with lawyers, with psychiatrists, and we somehow concluded that if we want to prevent dehumanization and torture as its extreme end, the only prevention would be deinstitutionalization, which means we have to disassemble large psychiatric hospitals or asylums, social asylums as well, in order to be sure that the human rights abuses will be better protected. That's nothing very new about it, but when you put it into the policies or the real concrete instruments for monitoring, it has some new, probably practical value. But today we will first talk about the quality rights. My colleague and dear friend Melita Murko and Dan Chisholm will have a presentation of what I understand is basically a summary of their today's discussion with the different country representatives. Quality rights is a fantastic instrument, that you all know, but also it is quite an important incentive and a process, I would say. So it would be very good to hear results of their today's work. Melita, you will start. And
Thank you very much, Vlado. So I'm not as regular in Trieste as Vladimir. This is only my second time here in 2 years. And now it feels as if I'm just going to continue with the presentation I had here last June. This is my share today will be to update you on the implementation of quality rights in the WHO European region through our largest inter-country project at the moment, which is the project on long-term institutions for people with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities. Before I start with the update, I have to take this opportunity, if I press the right button, to pay tribute to our regional director, Dr. Zuzana Jakab. She will be our regional director for 6 more days. She has supported this field of work, in short, deinstitutionalization efforts, from the very first day of her mandate and obviously till the very last day of her mandate. Here in this picture, this is a picture from her farewell party taken exactly a week ago, last Tuesday, in the heart of Copenhagen. And she is here together with Dr. Hans Kluge, who is now our newly elected regional director. He will take up his duties in February. And clearly his trust and support is yet to be earned. Just a quick reminder that one very, very large regional initiative and a very successful project under Dr. Jakab's leadership was the Declaration on the Health of Children and Young People with Intellectual Disabilities. For all of you who are working in this field, just a reminder that the declaration is still there, very as relevant today as it was at the time of its unanimous endorsement by member states as a WHO resolution in 2011. The following couple of years saw less activity at the regional level. The focus was instead on turning words into action, and I just put one example here, a project implemented by Lumos in Serbia, Bulgaria, and Czechia. It was a very innovative way of really turning words into action, which is how the project was called. And this brings us to 2015 and the launch of the current project on long-term institutions for people with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities, which is currently in its third phase of implementation. So last June, when I presented from this very spot, we were at the end of phase 2, and I presented here in quite some detail the findings of these quality rights assessments that we conducted in 24 member states and Kosovo in 98 long-term institutions. I will not be repeating the findings. I will just show you this because it really captures everything. The title chosen by the CNN, which is that European mental health institutions fall far below the standard WHO reports. If you remember, Michelle was telling us about the quality rights toolkit, among other things, on yesterday morning. So the toolkit comprises 25 standards, and what journalists from important international media found interesting was that not a single institution actually met all the 25 standards, which is to say that improvements are needed everywhere, but of course there are unfortunately too many institutions in Europe that are failing terribly almost at every single standard. So when we published the report, which was the main output of phase 2 in June last year, it did not take us long to agree on priorities for phase 3 because of obviously the findings were guiding us. The very first step was to organize a training on recovery planning and also the service transformation, at least some basic tools that we could share with our participating countries. We met for the first time in Vilnius just a couple of weeks after the publication of the report. We had teams from 14 countries with us. So that was our first step. The idea was that they go back to the institutions they had assessed in phase 2 of the project and discuss the findings with the management and staff and support them in preparing an improvement plan for each facility. This work is ongoing, and we actually talked a lot about that in this parallel session just before the coffee break. Then, thanks to the generous support by the German government, we just all of a sudden unexpectedly had some funds that were available to us. So we were able to expand this whole component, capacity building component of our project, and do a series of trainings on strategies to end the use of seclusion and restraint. Luckily, and thanks really to Michelle Funk, we had this module, which is one of 15 or so modules that are included in the new quality rights training and guidance materials. So we use that as our main material. This is just a picture from the training in Vilnius. And here is the list of countries where we did the training on seclusion and restraint. In Prague and in Zagreb, the participants included representatives from many psychiatric hospitals. I believe in Croatia it was like 22 different mental health services that attended, and in Prague, if I'm not mistaken, 14 hospitals were represented, and we are planning to do some follow-up there. In Latvia and in Serbia, we had a different approach, and we went to one large psychiatric hospital in each country to work with with the staff of those hospitals. In both cases, our experience was very, very interesting. Oh, I need to go back, sorry, because I must introduce my dream team. In case you would like to do this training, I strongly recommend Danny Angus from Mercy Care organization in the UK, who is a mental health nurse, lead mental health nurse. Next, he is the one with the big smile up the left. Next to him is Dr. Roger Banks, who is a psychiatrist and one of rare psychiatrists specialized in the field of intellectual disability. And we really, really appreciate his advice to our project. Jennifer Kilcoyne, also from Mercy Care, a clinical psychologist. And Peter Lloydel from Denmark, who had the hardest task, which was to ensure that the perspective of people with lived experience was heard and reflected upon in every session of our training. He did a terrific job. This is just an overview of the activities that are ongoing at the moment. The countries that are marked in yellow are the countries that are represented here and were with us in this internal meeting. So we are working on service transformation in selected institutions. The work is ongoing in all these countries. And then very importantly, the second line runs in 6 countries that have decided to translate the quality rights e-training. And as Michelle mentioned yesterday, this is really a fantastic opportunity for these countries. Once they have the e-training course available in their own language, they will be able to increase rapidly the mental health and human rights literacy in their countries. We are preparing for national launch events later this year. And of course, we are, especially Dan, is obsessing with documenting and measuring change, which we really take seriously, but we are aware that this is a huge challenge for our project because the kind of change that we are aiming at simply cannot be delivered in such a short space of time as we normally get through, 3 or 4 year projects. So that's all from me. Then over to you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Melita. I'm coming down. It's right, I'm not going to crowd surf. I thought, as it's getting late in the day, and I also want to use some of my colleagues' help in this little session, we want to just share with you the findings or the discussions that we just came at. I said yesterday that we were going to have an internal meeting, which we just finished, and we would share some of the messages and thoughts and that came out of that. So we basically focused in on 3 kind of topics. One was asking ourselves, well, what have we actually achieved to date? Second question was, what are the challenges along the way? What are the main kind of issues and barriers to change that these different countries have experienced? And then a third issue was around what are the next steps? What are the opportunities for over the next 1, 2, 3 years for meaningful change? So I'll just quickly go through those, and I'll pick on a couple of of the colleagues to share their experiences from a country level, which hopefully you'll find more interesting than me. So the first thing to say is that the Quality Rights Toolkit that's been developed so lovingly by colleagues in Geneva is a really good toolkit. And that's not me saying it, that's what the countries say all over. I go to Central Asia, they love it. They go to the Balkans, they love it. They go to Europe, they love it. They love to go to Africa, they love it. It's a really good toolkit. And that means it can be demanded and used at country level. So that's the first thing to say, because WHO produces lots and lots of guidance and toolkits, some of which are not well accepted at the country level. So it doesn't get used and it's not demanded. So that's the first win, I think, the first achievement in this region, regarded as relevant and useful. So then, of course, as Melita was just saying, there's been a whole series of training workshops, some at a more introductory level, but then also moving into more advanced topics based on what the countries are saying are the key issues that came out of the assessment process. So there's a logic to the dedicated or more deep dive training that we've done, for example, on reducing the use of seclusion and restraints. What about the actual impacts? Because as we were saying, or I was saying, you know, we can train a lot of people. WHO spends loads of money and time training people, but, you know, so what? I mean, if it doesn't convert into changed behavior, attitudes, and practices, it's kind of money wasted. So that's why, you know, I do obsess about it a bit, because if we can't demonstrate change, then that's a big problem in front of the policymaker, where you're saying, we need you to invest, you need to commit, you need to engage in this process. We need good story. It doesn't have to be smart statistical quantitative evidence. Stories of change, qualitative evidence can be just as powerful if it's well told. So with that in mind, I thought I would start here in the Czech Republic and ask Merrick, who's a quality manager in one of the facilities, to say something about what he's been able to achieve since the training, and how has he actually converted some of this knowledge into practice. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Marek. I work in a large psychiatric hospital in the Czech Republic. And since the quality rights assessment, I managed to get the management of the hospital on board and start to implement some changes that mainly the ones that do not require a full-scale education of the staff of the hospital, like, for example, covering the hospital ward with a Wi-Fi signal, like doing some technical measures and reconstructions in order to ensure privacy of patients and so on. And we also managed in the meantime to open up the hospital, all the relevant wards of the hospital, to the community service workers, in order for them to be able to work with our patients on their transfer and discharge to the community-based services. So this is just shortly the start. And next year we will have the e-training available, and we will focus on all the measures that really require to get the staff of the hospital on board, to engage them in implementing the changes themselves. And this in particular concerns the work with the restraint measures, because that's a very sensitive issue, and the staff of the department has to be fully on board with implementing any changes in order to maintain safety of the patients and the staff as well. So this is just in short. Thank you.
Great. So this is a good example of what I could call low-hanging fruit or quick wins. You know, you don't need a change of government or a change in law to enact these kind of changes. Of course, there are other longer-term changes which are also being planned. But something can be done in the shorter term is the point. If I can turn next to, to the policy space. So Croatia has got a very strong team, been working on this, and they've made some real gains as well. If you could just quickly share the experience of these information leaflets and how you managed to get those out to the places where they're needed.
Okay, thank you. I think that it's very important that in this project we change the culture toward the human rights culture. That's why we have decided to create leaflets on the information about the rights, with the information to patients about the rights during the involuntary hospitalization, voluntary hospitalization, about information about informed consent, about the coercion measure, and about legal capacity. And we wanted to that these leaflets should be available all over Croatia in all mental health institutions as well in social care institutions. So we sent a letter to the Ministry of Health using the authority and reference of WHO, what is very important to support this use of these leaflets, and send the letter to all institutions to put these leaflets on the web pages and to inform the patient about the rights using these leaflets. I think that it's actually first steps. We have to also work further to really help to that these leaflets are really distributed to the, and we already distributed all these leaflets in electronic and paper form to all institutions. And now we will monitor are these leaflets available to the patient, and after we will do a, let's say, soft pressure that this should be done. And we also informed the ombudsman and asked them for the help that they also recommend to use of these leaflets based on their really power which they have in their duties. So that's from Croatia.
Fantastic. So, Minister, convinced, issues a decree, things happen. That's the principle anyway, and sometimes it's the practice as well. It actually happens. So moving next to the some of the challenges. So we covered a number of themes just in the last couple of hours. So I'll just give you some flavor of some of those topics. So, for example, this well-known problem of the separation between health and social care. This is a nightmare in many countries and leads to all kinds of bad consequences for the people that we're trying to meet and help. And that's partly, also around the legal framework about what are the roles and responsibilities of different sectors. It also affects the financing and all kind of perverse incentives in practice. So this was one of the commonly stated issue. Another one is the kind of sometimes the imbalance between hospital providers on the one hand and community-based providers on the other. So in some countries, a lot of the power and influence is vested in hospital providers who hog the resources. This was the second one. A third one was around staffing, and a number of issues came up there. The initial resistance of staff to change of any kind, and that's partly maybe through lack of awareness that they're doing things which maybe are not very good. So that's of course where the education and awareness raising comes in. But also, the overload and comments from a number of countries. Well, yes, of course, give us more resources. If we had a staff ratio like we do in Germany, of course we can perform miracles. So this was a common retort. as was the phrase like, well, at this rate, you know, the rights of the residents, you know, are given much more priority than the staff. What about the staff's own rights? You know, was another comment that came up. So, finally, another, of course, topic that came up quite a bit was the issue of coercion in psychiatry, which might be the name of the film that we are making in Czechia, and the need, therefore, for particularly addressing this issue, as well as, of course, the recovery-based approaches and building up a better understanding and practice of that. Now, I'm going to wander over here to our friend John from the UK, who has been kindly helping us over the last couple of days and listening in as a somewhat neutral observer to all this frenzy of activity, and might have some thoughts as well.
Ciao, Trieste. Thank you ever so much. I was told to keep this brief because it's the end of the day, but just working with the countries and reflecting on the wonderful opportunity that we have to collectively make the small human and clinically and therapeutically led changes that can make a big difference to reduce barriers. And there's some great opportunity, very much inspired by learning these few days on how collectively we can make quality improvements. Ever the nerd or the geek, I don't know how that translates into Italian, forgive me, but we talked about, you know, being able to count and measure and to improve and use some really good scientific quality improvement approaches to make some real big changes. Some wonderful knowledge in the room and a great group of people that are all very much committed to a journey to make a difference for the people's lives that we seek to serve. So really good stuff.
Thanks, John. So, final topic or issues that we were discussing was, of course, the next steps and what are the opportunities that can be taken. So I've grouped them into 4 different issues. So the first was around new policies or new laws or even new governments, right? So we have to be somewhat opportunistic. You know, there was an example of a country said, well, not much is happening, but a new government is coming in which is pro-democratic. So they're actually interested in listening and are more aware of human rights as a policy issue. And of course, a number of countries are updating, revising their mental health strategy or policy, for example, in Croatia. So of course, those can contain a stronger emphasis on human rights in particular, partly based on the acquired knowledge and the materials. We have more ammunition, I could say, you know, to fire in that direction. A second topic was, of course, around the continued capacity building. It's proving totally insufficient, you know, in all the places we go, just to go and as soon as you do one training, then it's like there's a need for more. And of course, that also is due to the fact that there is turnover, not only many people to train, and it's actually impossible to do that in a face-to-face basis, and that's the whole idea behind the e-training. So, as well as continued face-to-face training workshops, which we will continue to do over the next year and more, we also have this opportunity in the form of the e-training and its rollout, which I think stands to greatly increase the levels of literacy around mental health and human rights, not only amongst providers, but also policymakers and even the general public, of course. So third out of 4 was, of course, implementation. So sometimes, you know, there's so much talk about planning and training and monitoring and evaluation. You know, let's not forget the implementation in the middle of it, and that's really the guts of it. And sometimes that's the hardest thing to do, right? To actually make the launch, the leap from the training to the implementation. And so early beginnings. You heard how some countries are going about that already, and it's trying to build up, I think, get some quick wins, show some success, patient engagement with relevant stakeholders, some of the critical ingredients to successful implementation. And finally, monitoring and evaluation is very important. Some of the countries did not talk much about the monitoring and the indicator side. Croatia was a good example that did, and I think that is extremely important for the reason I was saying before, that, and John was reinforcing this, John Trevane was reinforcing the importance of, what do you call it, John? Counting, measuring, counting, and improving. So, with good data systems, you can really make a very good point to those you're trying to target. So I just will leave the final word to my colleague Akfa, who is the project manager in our country office in Turkey. She's overseeing this huge project there, and they've been doing a big quality rights exercise over the last few months. So let's hear from Akfa.
Okay, thank you. We started a little bit late. I'm coming from a highly centralized country, and these institutions are under two ministries, mental hospitals under the Ministry of Health and social residential care institutions under the Ministry of Family. We have 10 mental health hospitals and 320 institutional care under the Ministry of Family and Social Services. We just completed quality rights assessment of those institutions. We could just evaluate 19 institutions, but somehow we think that we can understand the picture, and we shared the preliminary results with the ministry, which you can guess not so positive. But the ministries agreed on that it's time to change. It has a positive impact on them. And now we are starting 3 pilot projects. Why 3? Because one of them is the mental hospital, one of them is social care institution under the public sector, the other is social care institution under the private sector. Why we are piloting? Because our previous experiences in Turkey showed us that training and remote supervision didn't improve the quality too much. So we decided to go and stay there, have the on-the-job trainings, evaluate, monitor, count, and so show the improvement to the other services so that they can believe that the change is possible and they follow. The other thing we are doing is e-training. They really like it. In Turkey, they loved e-training, actually. The ministries and the parliament and the Higher Institute of the Human Rights agreed to go on with all staff under these ministries. And this Higher Council of Human Rights also would suggest it to the Ministry of Justice. So we are thinking that once it's all translated, we completed the translation, but it's already in Turkish. We can have the lunch. We are planning it on the 9th of December, and we invite you to the lunch, actually. After that, we are thinking that we can access big numbers of the staff on the e-training. Thank you.
So that's it, really. I'm sorry I couldn't get to some of the other countries who could also have contributed usefully to this discussion, but I wanted to make it a bit more interactive and emphasize the fact this is about, country-based implementation of of normative guidance produced at the headquarters level, kind of moderated through the regional level and implemented in countries with the support of our WHO country offices. So It's going pretty well, but we have some big challenges, not least with respect to resources. You know, you probably get the impression that, you know, WHO's got all these people and resources. You wouldn't believe how stretched and few we are and how starved we are of resources. And it's the same, you know, WHO is like the global Ministry of Health, and we have exactly the same problem trying to get funds into allocated to mental health compared to other priorities. So we share exactly the same problems. Anyway, thanks for your attention, and I'll pass it back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. We are still quite good with the time, so if you have any questions for our presenters, please. Yes, there is one. Stay with us to answer the questions.
Hi, I'm Leon from Enosh, Israel, and I want to ask if in any of these countries that did the programs, it influenced in some way on legislation related to recovery or legal capacity.
I think we have to go back to Croatia for an example of that. Maybe we could make the mic available. Where did the mic go? Could we have the mic back, please, for Dr. Slajana?
We really put all these things in our national strategy for mental health. You know, the national strategy is just a strategy, and now we are planning to make action plan, and actually the huge thing is that we try to make the implementation. Implementation is really, but it's already written. Relate to this legal capacity, we don't have in our law that you can be full deprived of legal capacity, only, let's say, partially deprived. But you know, that's I think that it's all country in the as far as I know, no country in Europe didn't change a law according to this legal capacity and this forced hospitalization. And I think that we have to make a discussion of that and find a reason and find let's say, reasonable solution to how to solve this problem.
Thank you. And if I can't see Alana, but from Romania, I think they're not. Yes, Dr. Alana, at the back, please. If you could take the mic, because they are actually in the process of updating their mental health law, and she was just speaking earlier about how the availability of quality rights and related materials is. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, this year we have worked during 12 months, I think there will be now, and to the revision of the mental health law, which issued for the first time in 2002 and was revised in 2012. And I must confess that quality rights elaborated from the WHO was of a great help in defining a nice chapter, a good, nice chapter about the rights of the mental disabled people. And also, I would want to say that the staff, the professionals, have also some words to say and to be written in this law about the rights of the staff, the staff which is involved in the care and the cure of disabled people. Thank you.
Thank you. So there is a progress. Is there any other questions? If not, I would like to thank Melita and Dan for this presentation and this collaborative work. It's really a remarkable thing to have all these countries working together and discussing problems, because it's always interesting how to see how they are very much common in all different places. Okay, so thank you once more. And I would like to invite Dr. Messina and Tomas of Bonavicio. If I move over. Okay.
Hello, good evening. It's very late, so we try to be quick, but the topic is important. I think there was an event that it was called the Trieste Declaration. This happened in 2011 when we did one of the first international conferences within the umbrella, the Franca and Franco Basaglia International School and the WHO Collaborating Center of Trieste. And we had at that time a good representation, particularly from Europe, because the focus was particularly in Europe. The conference was called Beyond the Walls. So deinstitutionalization was one of the most important topics, the transition from hospital to community, and also using international cooperation. So we, after that declaration that we constructed using a number of experts, but particularly focused on the Italian experience and the local experiences, we found the need, we found it was important to check some of the statements that were in that document using a qualitative research, so developing a questionnaire that was for the first time able to verify the content as well as the theoretical background of the declaration to gather evidence and particularly narratives of good practices, because what we think was lacking in previous efforts done, including some other later on, done also by the WHO with the Gulbenkian Foundation. There is an important document called Innovations in Institutionalization, and other researches. Recently, one has been published by the group around Cho and Priebe. These are based on very general contents, which are sound, of course. They can be shared. You can identify with those topics. On the other hand, they remain very general. They remain a little bit poor in terms of indications for the practice. And the problem to transfer the know-how that comes from the successful and not so much successful experiences, all the attempts done in institutionalization in many parts of the world remain a central topic in our opinion. We start from the local experience because Trieste was described in many ways, including stories, a famous book by Pepe Dell'Acqua called Non ho l'arma che uccide il leone, I don't have the gun to kill the lion, stories from the psychiatric hospital. And so apart from these kind of narratives, it was very difficult to find the common elements, the suggestions, the indications that can be useful, and sometimes the example of good practices that someone can use and take back home and try to implement in their own practices. At the same time, of course, WHO was developing the Toolkit of quality rights and the whole set of the instruments which today are available, and we gave some small contribution also to the development of some of those. But so we started with the idea of semi-structured interviews on the process of phasing out mental hospitals, just on the process, not just describing if decentralization is good or not good, if it's evil, if done in the American way, it's better if done in the Italian way, and so, but just describing what can be done in the process of care. So we proposed a sample of protagonists of this process in several countries. We started with a cohort in 2011. This cohort was taken from a vast group of participants were invited, but because the questionnaire was carefully designed, but too long probably, so the responses were limited, particularly to East European countries that seem to be the most motivated to write something, particularly from the obstacles they found. And one of the people were interviewed is here, Jan Pfeiffer, and other people from other countries that were in touch at that time, particularly from the Stability Pact group. And then we decided to send again a second round, expanding to the world, and so trying to include places in Asia that we know that are going to be successful, places also in other countries, particularly South America, which has a great story of good examples of decentralization, and inviting also English-speaking countries, because in those countries the process is quite different than what happened in Latin countries or in South European countries. So taking all these differences together, we defined, we had some area of investigation that we identified, because we didn't want to take the process of phasing out psychiatric hospital. That doesn't mean deinstitutionalization per se, it's a component, and we'll come back quickly to this point, according to the possibility of deconstructing this process, describing the process, and like a slow motion, looking in what's happening during those phases, and that are developed in different ways, upon the action of some leaders, or using policy makers or policies that can be useful to do this top-down or bottom-up adventures of some group of leaders, etc. So the meaning of decentralization as a wider concept. The second was how to do it. The third was how to transform particularly the staff culture and the resistance we can find in institutions, changing the relationship, which is the most probably important aspect, with the user, with the people who are in the hospitals, and generally speaking, in the society requiring mental health care, changing the organization of life in the hospital, what can be done practically. I learned a lot before coming to Trieste from the first writings in the Italian experience. People here, we have Lorenzo Torresini, who wrote a wonderful paper about that, and other people about what are the steps. And then the macro intervention in terms of policies. So we use two analysis methods. So we are just in the process of closing this analysis, and so we don't have here just preliminary results. We don't have the recommendation ready because we need a second round with a Delphi exercise among all the participants to the interviews. There was a categorical analysis using the principles of grounded theory, and the second, a thematic analysis. We use inductive identification of keywords, examples, national and local. They are very helpful, in my opinion. Discrete definitions of some aspects, but also contradictions, because there are not all the pathways to decentralization are done in the same way. Some are contradictory, the opposite sometimes, and controversial issues among them. Of course, describing which are the new components of the system of mental health care in the community that can be really helpful to overcome hospitals. So collect all the opinions, apart from what is known from literature, from evidence-based amount of practice, etc. And then we include quotations of the text. So we can start maybe Tommaso. Tommaso did the thematic analysis, so he can make you some example of those things to give you the flavor, because we are going to issue quite a substantial report that is about 100 pages, but with a summary that can help to navigate within that. But I think it's important to preserve all these nuances, all these different aspects, so people can read and reflect, starting from the real experience of those who have done that. This is another difference I would like to underline, because usually people interviewed are mental health leaders. Many of them were not active when deinstitutionalization experiences, particularly the pioneer ones, were developed, so they heard. It was a sort of second-hand knowledge, or they just read papers, or they were part of a national policy, but they haven't done by themselves those steps. So it was important to gain a group of people with a real experience as being leaders of those changes. Please, Tomas.
Yeah, we will pass very quickly because the number of questions, items, issues is huge, and so we start with the first area, that is the meaning of the institutionalization. And the first question was about in what way certain contextual characteristics of the psychiatric hospitals can influence the institutionalizations. And so we have a very wide description about the structure of the hospital, where the hospital is, the connection or the lack of connection with other community services and with the community in a broad sense, and also the social and the economic impact of the psychiatric hospital, and what are the staff needs and opinions about the staff, the psychiatric hospital. We have here collected some opinions by the...
Yes, for instance, we recorded some particularly significant declaration. One comes from Esmina Vizbegovic from Bosnia. He said, psychiatric hospital with this characteristic of long-term, sometimes lifelong treatment and accommodation of patients with mental disorders is patronizing approach, isolation, application of violence, directing the treatment only toward the illness, and the hospital staff with a patient-controlling relation, role of a society guardian from patients with mental disorders, abuse of power, and its not profitability mainly influence the beginning of the institutionalization process. I think it's a very clear set of issues. And of course, the same author said the decrease of psychiatric hospital accompanied with changes within the approach toward the person with mental disorder, and the creation of alternative services within the community represents the institutionalization. It's a technical definition, which is quite interesting for me.
Yeah, the second question is about the institutionalization with or without the development of community services. So the difference between the institutionalization and the hospitalization as an administrative intervention, and so that real institutionalization is where there are community alternatives in the community, and there is also a change in the way the support is given, and there is a human rights respect.
The example was this is the summary of, this can be the germ for a recommendation, not just downsizing, de-hospitalizing or trans-institutionalizing, but a reconversion to a comprehensive community mental health system that meets all the needs of people with different mental health issues, change the approach, empowerment and active role of users with preparation of community living. And this is one of the diversion, except for a relatively small number of people. This is a colleague from Australia wrote that. So for some people, still some need or some different solution, and reconversion of our human resources is the most difficult. Someone said, better have new staff. So that's some of the nuances that we are trying to find out.
There is the theme of the role of the political and administrative decision makers, and so their role can be only declarative, someone says, or more concrete, and so changing laws, policies, planning and financing alternative services, but also the role of technicians, and so how the two levels can interact in a proper way, in a good way. There is also a request to explain which is the understanding of the concept of the institutionalization.
And these are some of the examples of how it's complex to define. On one hand is the process of closure, of downsizing of large psychiatric hospital and the establishment of alternative services in the community. But decentralization is just in one part related to downsizing and final closing of psychiatric hospital. But on the other hand, it is the expression of a holistic and integral vision of human being. So this is the first time we clearly saw that the new concept arising in the last years is that the protagonism of people with mental health issues, it could be described as full humanization in the widest sense, as the antithesis of dehumanization of psychiatric hospitals, with a focus on whole person, promoting independence, etc. And finally, a radical paradigm shift, changing the old institutional thinking and practices against the risk of reproducing the old culture in the new community services. A complete change of attitude and culture that include the whole society with all its possibility to take responsibility for comprehensive treatment. And then other definitions, so go beyond seclusion, choose the system of support the people need, changing the whole relation, etc. These are developed in the following questions. And some exemplary definition. In summary, decentralization is a process to help the user to recover all human rights and the role like citizens with a new type of mental health service in the community where the users are the active subjects. Is a process that seeks or unleashes the potential of people to know and express themselves as individuals, their strengths and personhood, recognized and respected, allows them to make and participate in critical choices that affect their personal lives and well-being, be free from stigma, etc. And the third is very nice. So it's far beyond the mere humanization. It is an individual and collective process of emancipation and liberation from the denounce of the institutional violence to fight against norms and disciplines that regulate collective life and affect social relationships. So it's far beyond just an action within the psychiatric hospital. It can affect the whole society. And this is one of the ethos, I think, that has been expressed by many of those that have made those changes, not just in Italy, but in other countries.
Then some negative effects, possible negative effects of the distorted institutionalization process, and so from reinstitutionalization or trans-institutionalization, or the problem of surviving of psychiatric hospital, and so having a double system, more fragmented, less efficient. The problem when the community mental health services, the alternatives are not good, not of good quality, unsafe conditions, bad working conditions also for staff, bad practices, and then the risk of homelessness, no social inclusion, no care, no treatment, no rehabilitation, no support, and also the negative effects on families and community.
And this is one of the definitions that is comprehensive of transitionalization, is defined as the moving of mental health clients from one institution, such a mental hospital, to being dependent on another type of institution, such as shelter, community hospital, jail, nursing home facility, room and board facility. That means it's very comprehensive, not just from a hospital to another hospital, but to other settings of reproduction of institutional culture. It's a consequence of incorrect deinstitutionalization and not carefully planned alternatives and staff practice changes. Distortions that can happen are investment in improving institutions only, so repainting the walls, like our friends in Serbia maybe sometimes said, not developing sustainable community mental health services, not targeting inpatient or mental hospitals, leaving them behind, inside, not changing institutional culture, etc., developing community services, but not reducing the capacity of psychiatric hospitals. So from a famous parallel system and shifting responsibility to severe patients. There are many effects described, like falling through the cracks in the system, leads to unmet needs, isolation, stigma, discrimination, homelessness, and increasing relapse. So, yeah.
Yeah, another area is how to deinstitutionalize, and so how can the psychiatric hospital be downsized or suppressed with community structured services in place, or we can wait, or the two process starts together. And so here are different opinions, and this reflect different ways in which the institutionalization processes started in around the world. And so someone stressed more on the contemporaneous and parallel downsizing of the psychiatric hospitals with the alternative services developing. Others says, no, it's better to close the first and then have a new start.
And this is one of the most controversial issues, because the issue of creating services and the new services while they're still out there, psychiatric hospital. This is contained, for instance, in the WHO document, and well, I personally don't agree too much. It can be true for some countries, but it contains a lot of risks. And reconversion is required. This is the general opinion, the vast majority of the interviewed people, and will take place at any step. So stepwise reconversion, after careful planning, community-based service development must resonate with changing and closure within the hospital, like closure of beds and wards, but bridging new funds are necessary for initiating the process, and gradual and parallel development of community-based services is required, possibly with so-called pre-community services inside the hospital, so the development of incubators of services within the hospital.
So the issue about from where to start, and so from within the psychiatric hospital, within the institution, and so changing the vision, the leadership, mobilize institutional resources, the staff should take responsibility and so start this process, or patient involvement and empowerment, or on the other side, the political support, the community involvement, NGOs, associations, and other services, or the complex of the two.
And among the opinion, for instance, that this is a complex systemic process involving political support and intersectoral cooperation. Institutions are closed systems, resistant to change, and only inherent willingness of the institution allows evolution. So that's a recognition. There should be some willingness inside to change. It's impossible to do it from the outside, because the risk is just to change the place and close a structure, but recreate the culture and the mindset in the new services that are coming up. So vision and strong effective leadership are required, and the primary intervention that must start from the inside and also help from the outside. Legislation, campaign, advocacy, social action, work with the NGOs, families, partnership with community organizations. This is a whole set of recommendations of things to do in order that the process become very effective, and focusing on patients' rights. In the second set of questionnaires filled, the influence of the CRPD, the Quality Rights Program, and the issue of human rights was arising more clearly from the responders, and we will see in one of the last questions.
So the question about how to decrease the number of beds, and so clinical ways to reduce beds, and so with new services and specific treatment interventions and models, or with non-clinical ways, so supporting patient needs into the community, or other ways, an administrative that is just cutting beds, or other strategies working more with community and formal and informal actors of the community, from social services to association, NGOs, with families.
Yes, and the recognition that it's important to have administrative acts and pressure, otherwise there is no decentralization. So the beds can be replaced again reduced beds can reduce demand, but of course, we can have a risk of filling up again the beds if they are not cut administratively. So the two things should come together. Well, this is a suggestion here: new community service system introduced in the first 2 to 4 years of change the process to see the results of reducing hospital beds before the number of beds in the community are decided. So the new services should be introduced in the very beginning alongside the closure of the psychiatric hospital. It's an interactive process among the two components. And other suggestions we will take now, of course.
What about if the implementation process, the process of implementation is incomplete, and so if the psychiatric hospital remains? So here there are different opinions. Someone says psychiatric culture, the risk is that psychiatric culture, the old psychiatric culture, just replace the institutionalizations, and so we can come back. So delays in the complete closure of psychiatric hospital, the risk of future reversal of the institutionalization, the perverse of opportunity to use the psychiatric hospital beds if you have there, and so more expenses if two parallel models exist, the distortion of the community services, the stigma that is not fought well, and the risk of trans-institutionalization and homelessness. Is it possible to resolve the problem of our hardcore patients? And
the most difficult ones.
Yeah. Here are some suggestions. So an individualized approach, considering the patient's need, using a complex community recovery-focused intervention model, not just keep this as a justification to let the psychiatric hospital survive. And so other suggestion about specific residential facilities or collaboration with social services. I think one of the most important is the last one, that is an ethical issue, not just to abandon people. So difference between high, low, middle income countries, and sorry, we will go quite quickly. How to transform hospital-based psychiatry and so staff culture. Here are what to do. Is the criticism of psychiatry's custodial mandate a good or a bad option? So someone says it's better to have a strong criticism, that it is essential to the institutionalization process. Someone else said no, it's better to avoid excessive criticism, just finding alternatives. So what to do about...
It's one of the points of today's discussion you had in the group, so about abolishing practices of violence and restraint. It was very interesting. The suggestion, and to be compared with the WHO suggestion included in the Manual of Quality Rights, comes from the experience of people.
Yeah. Yeah, about a total abolishment or keeping something, and so there was also the contradiction about what to keep. Someone say no, it is to completely abolish or nothing change. Someone else say no, we can keep something. There are barriers, there are reasons to keep restraint as a tool, and then there is instead a set of issue to face, to deal with this. The top-down or bottom-up approach to the institutionalization. The bottom-up is a little bit more, how to say, complete. Maybe the top-down is just, yeah, we need the political support, and that was the historical way to the institutionalization. While now the focus is more on the community pressure on politicians, of users and families, empowerment and involvement in decision making, but also both the directions should be taken into account.
then some of the examples, but now we have to cut because, of course, there are detailed suggestions how to empower staff, the use of staff meeting, staff training, the comparison visit to other services, the valorization of the staff, because one of the things that happened, for instance, in our experience, I described today in my presentation in the morning, was this sort of parallel empowerment. One of the questions that was taken in your discussion today in the group, the staff needs and rights, as opposed to the patient's needs and rights, this can be composed in a total change of the organization. They cannot be represented really and recomposed in not changing the organization, which is hierarchical with the patient at the bottom and etc. So there are some suggestions how to create a movement of participation, shared values within the team. Yes, and the contribution of external actors like members of the community, the role of course, national forums, associations, policymakers, training, sensitization, sensibilization, etc. And the fourth part was about changing relationship with the user, so changing institutionalized behavior, responding to needs, reconstructing life stories, and so a number of other suggestions. We can do quickly and cut till maybe
so how to change the institutional behavior, what is important from transforming the institutional relationship, and so the service values focus on human rights and community practice to change the service organization, the innovative leadership, users at the center, and how to restore voices. So the user's involvement, the co-construction of the mental health system, to support the user empowerment and social role, having meaningful activities, the family involvement, staff approaching users as a whole person. And then the chapter of the changing the organization of life in the hospital. And here there are many suggestions about humanization, and so how to humanize the psychiatric hospital with different strategies, but in the end the risk is that hospital humanization is just the risk to postpone a real deinstitutionalization.
And like the second step described the Italian experience, we use it, but we found not really understood by respondents, so-called the step also called liberalization, so opening the door, but keeping the institution still there, which is important, recognized as an important step, but we have an historical example that Basaglia proved on his skin in Gorizia when the experience was closed because the administration didn't want to move on toward community-based services, and the changes, as usual in the community therapy, in the therapeutic community approach by Maxwell Jones, were only done within the institution. So that's the risk, while the third step was a real deinstitutionalization. And so with all the steps, how to guarantee life in the community, what are the support systems, what are the basic components of community services recognized by those leaders. And so the macro intervention at the level of administration, civil society, judicial and forensic psychiatric system, the legal framework, integrate mainstreaming in general health care, and how to integrate within welfare systems. So, and suggesting to reconvert. I think human rights was focused in some of the responses, if you want to say.
Yeah, it has been considered by many responders as a useful tool for training and education of staff. Many say it's useful in the daily practice, not just in theory, and so a focus of many respondents on the implementation of international recommendation, and yeah.
Yes, and then going to a conclusion, but these are, we don't want to anticipate because these are the preliminary recommendations that we are developing. Of course, taking into account the issue of coercion that has been undertaken by WHO and the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights and other bodies about the abolishment of coercion in line with the CRPD, and work on the social determinants. These are the new words, coming up from the Special Rapporteur on the right to health, recent document by Dionyspouras on the social determinants, and what we said, the concept of whole life. So there are literature comparison we are going to do. With these are some of the articles we took into consideration.
Yeah, an article by Chu and other that it was more about what drives changes in institutionalized mental health care. They take the issue from another point of view. So after 1990s, a reinstitutionalization tendency, and so they try to analyze, and so we compare their results, these 4 themes they find out with other. We found the same of them, but we also, our research, the respondents of our research focused more on users' role, staff commitment and reaction to the change, community and stakeholders' involvement, and the focus on human rights. And so also the number, the methodology was quite similar, but the approach, the results are quite different. And in the end, with this this manual by the WHO on innovation in the institutionalization, a survey that found out 5 principles for the institutionalization, and we would like to compare better our result with these. And so some limitation, we did not a worldwide investigation. For instance, we miss Africa. The in-depth semi-structured interview was quite deep, but it did not consent further investigation face-to-face. And also the possibility that we have a purposive sampling of people that are in contact with Trieste and Trieste experience, so the model could be quite similar and we could miss some aspects. And further perspective are to complete the analysis, to achieve a broader conceptualization and understanding, to test the emergent themes again with the same experts. It's not a nightmare, yes. We hope, or with other experts.
We would like
shorter.
Yes. Yes, we obsess them because it is a very difficult questionnaire. But anyway, I think all of these teams can be checked in a second round, so-called the Delphi exercise, to select the most agreed of those, but not forgetting the diversity of the process. So the contexts are so different, so it's difficult to find a manual with guidelines which are very strict, just to describe the range of possibilities and have the sort of catalogs of action that it can be, in my opinion, in our opinion, can be helpful for helping those who are starting now this process or complementing what is the Quality Rights doing. Thank you very much.
We have time just for a few questions if anybody wants to contribute. It's already too late. If there are no questions, it's only left to conclude this session. Thank you very much. Thank to our presenters. We will have all these published things and so on. See you tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Am I right? 9. Okay. Have a good night.